My brother convinced my children I was too strict and they should break my rules. He called me furious when my kids taught his children to do the same. My brother Derek showed up at my house on a Saturday morning in March and found Sophie doing her weekend chores. She was 11 years old and wiping down the kitchen counters, while Lucas, who was 9, swept the floor. Derek watched them work for a minute, then said loud enough for them to hear, "Your dad makes you do chores on the weekend? That's rough. At my house, weekends are for fun." Sophie looked up at me to see my reaction, and I felt something tighten in my chest. Derek had this casual way of undermining me that always seemed innocent on the surface but carried a message underneath. I told Sophie and Lucas they were doing great and to finish up so we could go to the park. After they left the kitchen, I pulled Derek aside and told him not to comment on my parenting choices. He laughed and said he was just joking around, that I needed to lighten up. He said kids needed freedom to be kids, and I was being too controlling. I reminded him that teaching responsibility through age-appropriate chores was basic parenting, not control. He shrugged and said his kids, Ethan and Olivia, didn't have to do chores, and they were turning out fine. I let it drop because arguing with Derek never went anywhere productive. He'd always been the fun uncle who gave kids candy before dinner and let them stay up late, while I was the boring dad who enforced bedtimes and screen time limits. The comments continued over the next few weeks. Derek would visit and make observations about my rules that sounded supportive but weren't. When Sophie asked if she could have her phone at the dinner table, I said no because we had a family rule about device-free meals. Derek said, "That's smart, but don't you think kids need to learn to self-regulate instead of just following rules?" He delivered it with this thoughtful expression that made it sound reasonable, but Sophie heard the underlying message that my rule was maybe unnecessary. When Lucas asked to play video games past his 1-hour weekday limit, I said no and explained we'd agreed on this limit together. Derek happened to be there and said, "An hour seems pretty strict. Kids these days grow up with technology. Limiting it too much might make them obsessed with it." Lucas looked at me with this expression that said, "Even Uncle Derek thinks you're being unfair." I felt my frustration building because Derek was systematically teaching my kids to question every boundary I set. My wife Rebecca noticed it too and mentioned that Derek seemed to have a lot of opinions about our parenting lately. I told her he'd always been this way, thinking his permissive approach was superior to actual structure and discipline. The real problem started in April when Derek began having private conversations with Sophie and Lucas. I'd walk into a room and find him whispering to them, and when I asked what they were talking about, he'd say something vague about school or friends. Sophie started pushing back on rules she'd previously accepted without issue. When I reminded her to do her homework before watching TV, she said, "Uncle Derek says sometimes kids learn better when they're relaxed first." I asked when Uncle Derek had said that, and she looked caught, like she'd revealed something she wasn't supposed to. I called Derek that evening and asked him directly what he'd been telling my kids. He acted confused and said he'd just been giving them some perspective about different parenting styles. He said I was being paranoid and creating problems where none existed. He suggested that if Sophie was questioning my rules, maybe the rules themselves were the problem, not his conversations with her. I told him to stop undermining my authority with my own children. He said he was just being a good uncle and helping them think critically. I said teaching kids to disrespect their parents wasn't critical thinking, it was manipulation. He laughed and hung up on me. Lucas started sneaking video games late at night. I caught him at 11:30 on a school night playing on his tablet under his blankets. When I confiscated the device and reminded him of our rules, he said, "Uncle Derek says rules without good reasons are just about control." I felt rage spike through me because those were clearly Derek's exact words coming out of my 9-year-old son's mouth. I asked Lucas when Uncle Derek had told him that. Lucas hesitated, then admitted Uncle Derek had texted him a few times and they talked about how some parents use rules to control kids instead of helping them grow. I was stunned that Derek was now secretly texting my children to undermine my parenting. I grabbed Lucas's tablet and found the messages. Derek had been messaging both Sophie and Lucas for weeks, telling them their dad was too strict, that other kids their age had more freedom, that they should try breaking small rules to prove they could handle more responsibility. One message to Sophie said, "If your dad sees you can be responsible even without his strict rules, he'll have to admit he's been too controlling." Derek was coaching my children on how to manipulate me. I showed the messages to Rebecca and she was furious. She said this crossed a line from annoying uncle into actual interference with our family. I drove to Derek's house that same night and confronted him in his driveway, and that's when things took a turn I never expected. To see the full story, click the link below or go on my channel.